A strategy is a set of choices that compels people you don't control, the customer, to take actions that you would like them to take.
Some things need to be believed until they're seen.
If you have to strip out the data because you have no data about the future, then you either win or lose on the basis of the strength of the logic. The outcomes of today are a result of cumulatively all the choices we've made up till today. It comes about imagining the future. In the part of the world where things can be other than they are, the job of human beings is to be the cause of the effect they want to see.
The larger the spreadsheets, the more confident an organization is in its process. All those numbers, all those analyses feel scientific, and in the modern world, scientific equals good.
If you want to be a great strategist, hang around with the real operating people. 100% of the world's data is in one era, the past.
Welcome everyone to our next conversation with Roger Martin. This is now the fourth time that we're speaking, Roger. Thank you so much for making yourself available. In our last conversation, I brought up the idea to go through each of the topics of your new book here, A New Way to Think. And today we're actually going to cover two of those topics, one of them being strategy, the other being data. Both of them are part of, or are part two, which is about making choices. And for me, especially being a founder, CEO myself, but also working with a ton of organizations on the top leadership level, but also in teams that build individual products, I always see choice making, choice creation, and ultimately choice making as being one of the biggest bottlenecks, one of the biggest challenges they face in terms of speed, one, but also in terms of the quality of decisions that they make. And therefore, I was excited to see these two topics in your book, and I'm very much looking forward to dive into those two topics. So welcome to today's conversation, Roger.
Terrific. It's good to be back. This is getting to be a thing, huh?
Yeah, it is already a thing. I mean, 4 times, it's not coincidence anymore. So before we got the recording started, I asked you a question, and then we decided to bring it into the main conversation. In your book, you have ordered the different topics, obviously, and the topic of strategy comes prior to the topic of data. Now, when I was going through this, I was like, for me, it would be more intuitive to start with the topic of data and then jump into the topic of strategy. But you mentioned to me that there is a logic, and I'd be happy to explore that with you.
Sure. They could have gone in the other way, but the logic for having them in the order that they are is that the chapter on data will make more sense in the context of understanding what strategy kind of really is and what strategy entails. If you reverse them, you'd sort of have to take on faith a little bit what I say about data as being important to strategy. So that's why they were in the order they are. But you could do it the other way.
Yeah, but then let's follow your logic. Although I had planned to go with data first, but we don't want to take that faith that people already understand what strategy is. Although you and I had a conversation around that, but not everyone might have heard it. So let's start with the strategy piece first. And I will, as we did last time, from time to time also quote sections of the book. The intention of this conversation is not to make the book redundant. It's to show people what are the topics, what are the models that people can learn by diving deeper into the book. But from time to time, there will be some quotes. So you start this topic on strategy with, and every topic has this one big theme about it. And this one is about, so strategy, what counts is what would have to be true, not what is true. So you already go into the possibility and not so much in the analysis of what is today. And you make this very specific by very big at the beginning, starting with the larger the spreadsheets, the more confident an organization is in its process. All those numbers, all those analyses feel, you emphasize that feel, scientific. And in the modern world, scientific equals good. Let's start with this quote. And go into this a bit deeper. What have you observed in organizations that bring you to write this? And what have been the implications of organizations having this huge spreadsheets and feeling this safety of science?
Yeah. Well, it's been an evolution, Sohrab. I'm older than you are, and so I've sort of been at this since the early 1980s. I started my career in 1981, for what it's worth. So sort of four decades. And what has been obvious to me across that has been science has ever more kind of taken over the discipline of management, and in particular strategy. And that's part of a societally wide phenomenon, I think, which is we're getting more and more confident in science, and in the world of public policy, that's now a big thing that's thrown around. Oh, we made this decision scientifically, and if you didn't make it scientifically, that's considered a bad thing. And so I often laugh and say, if a client of mine, let's say a CEO, would have gone to the board in 1981 and said, kind of, here's why we believe this. The R squared is 0.72, which is extremely high. The board would have said, kind of, what is this crazy mumbo jumbo R squared? Like, come back and talk real business to us, right? In 2021, 40 years later, or 2022 this year, if you didn't go to the board with an R squared, they'd say, "Where's your statistical analysis?" That's how much it's changed, and so what the preponderance of being scientific and the centrality of being scientific has done, of course, is focused us all on the data about which we can be scientific. Right? Because that's the only thing you have to be scientific is data, right? We crunch the data, and here's our chart, and here's the R squared of the line, and that focuses you on the here and now, what's going on now, what is the present, and with great kind of analysis. If you're doing strategy, if you do great analysis and you are not optimizing what's going on now, that can enormously help you optimize, right? If you just say, wow, here's an opportunity, here's how things work now, and we're not taking advantage of exactly how things work now. But I think I'm sure you'd agree with me, Sohrab, is if strategy was limited to that, right, we'd never have anything new, great, breakthrough kind of in the world, right? Because that does not come out of analysis of now. It comes about imagining the future. And what imagining the future necessitates you asking is this question, not what is true, right? Because that's a science question. The science question is what is true, right? Einstein was not asking the question, what could he make true, right? He was asking, what is true about large and small gravitational forces, etc. He's trying to find the truth of what is.
What is around us? Absolutely.
What is around us? What exists now, rather than asking a question about, well, what could be, right? And then what would have to be true for that to be a good idea? Because, as you say, the job of management is to make choices, right? Is to make real choices, do some things and not other things. And so you'd have to have enough confidence that something that would have to be true could be made true for you to make a choice to do that thing. And so that's why what would have to be true focuses you on future possibilities. What is true focuses you on simply optimizing what is.
What is, and on data that you got from the past.
That's right. Because last time I checked, Sohrab, 100% of the world's data is in one era, the past. What data do we have for the future? We don't. Although interesting enough, I've made this point many times. And one one of the world's greatest demographers was from the university. I was a professor at the University of Toronto. His name is David Foote, and he said, Roger, the one thing we know a hell of a lot about the future is demographics. We can project out how many people are going to be 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now, how old they'll be, all of that pretty accurately. That one doesn't change very, very quickly. So he said, that's something where we have some, and that's sort of maybe the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah. But even there, you mentioned the word project.
Yes.
We can project how many people there are going to be, right? And that does not involve knowing that whether there's going to be a pandemic, which could be much worse than the one that we've been through,
yes.
or whether there is some other effect, like a world war. I mean, nobody wants that, but it's a possibility.
Sure.
And all of those could actually have a big impact on the demographics. So even those numbers where we are fairly certain they are projections and they're not real data, which always comes from the past. Now, getting to the point that you mentioned, I think another problem that we see a lot is scientific is equal to data crunching.
Yes.
Whereas if you go back hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, the scientific process rather started with observation.
Yes.
Right? Darwin did first observation and then he collected the data around those things, right? Aristotle did observation, although in some areas he didn't observe enough, predicting or mentioning that women have less teeth than men do, right? That would have been an easy matter of observation to see, no, it's not true, right? But this observation piece, be it either talking to employees, doing the Gemba, right? Talking to your customers, all of that I see not being valued enough compared to the data crunching. That's one, right? So this aspect of a scientific process, I would believe to be very, very helpful in terms of making choices. The other is that you pointed out, right? If you look at what is true, is either today or more likely the past, what would be true opens possibilities. And a few years back, I heard a Steve Jobs quote, which was, some things need to be believed until they're seen. Whereas the scientific approach is always, okay, I have to see it, observe, and then I have to collect data around it. And then I have to see that it actually happens in a certain pattern. And ideally, I can describe it with a mathematical equation, right? But if you're thinking about strategy and especially innovation, then you have to have this imagination piece and you go really deep into this. And one of the quotes that I liked here, in strategy, what counts is what would have to be true, not what is true, which we already mentioned. And this means developing a winning strategy involves the creation and testing of novel cause-effect hypotheses and the identification of what must be different about the world for those hypotheses to work. Let's explore this a bit more, and then we dive into a 7-step approach that you've outlined in this book to come up with a strategy using a different model compared to what most organizations do. But before we get into this, let's talk a bit about this hypothesis, identifying new cause and effect, etc.
Yeah, which is one of my interesting quests, Sohrab, is because the world has gotten so scientific and the practice of business, especially business academy, has gotten so scientific. And the first step in the scientific method is not analysis. It's create a hypothesis, do an experiment, analyze and decide whether your hypothesis was more right than wrong. And if you look at the world of PhD programs in business and elsewhere, you can find thousands and thousands of PhD courses on analytical methods, right? Sampling methods, data collection methods, kind of methods for making inferences, all of that. But I'm on a quest, and if you can find one, I would love to hear about it. I have still not found in any PhD program anywhere on the planet a course on hypothesis generation. Isn't this amazing? Isn't this just stunning, right?
It
So I laugh and say I'm not sure where if scientists really know where babies come from, right? It's sort of like the stork drops a hypothesis down the chimney, and suddenly you have kind of a baby that you can kind of experiment with and analyze and the like. I mean, and I've talked to many like really thoughtful professors about this, colleagues of mine, about kind of why not, and they're kind of flabbergasted, right? And it's interesting. It gets to sort of a Tom Wolfe right stuff kind of thing, which is since you're not taught how to search for a novel hypothesis, right? Then it's sort of hit or miss. You either have the right stuff, like with Tom Wolfe, how do you know you're have the right stuff to be a test pilot? You're not dead. You can land your plane. You didn't have the right stuff if you go up and crash. And so one of the saddest things in the entire academic world, after having been dean for 15 years, is if you can't come up with a novel hypothesis that's interesting enough to experiment on and test, you ain't getting tenure. Right, because you'll be writing boring papers that don't add to anything, that get rejected, and then you don't have enough of a resume to, when the tenure committee comes up, they say, sorry, you haven't proven excellence in research, which is generally what you have to prove to get tenure. And so I think it's sort of sad, right, that essentially these PhD students are spit out with all sorts of, here's how to do testing, right? Here's how to set up a sample and collect data. Here's how to analyze it. Here's how to make inferences of it. But they aren't taught the first step. And then they're sent out and said, okay, be a researcher now. So it's kind of a weird world, a world that has gotten scientific and has forgotten about your step of how do you observe the world and come up with a novel hypothesis. And by the way, not to get directly to the but not to get off on too much of a tangent, but my belief, right, is that the modern world of science draws the eye to the regression line. So just think about a scatter plot that's got a pretty strong regression or strong correlation. Look at and so just the act of doing that draws your eye to the line and to explanations of why the line is there, right? And it draws your eye away from the anomalies, the outliers. And I think it's the outliers I think it's in the outliers that you can come up with novel hypotheses, right? Rather than saying that's completely, utterly random, saying to yourself instead, I got to have a theory for why that exists. And I think that's what gets you novel hypotheses that move the ball forward. It's not the regression line that helps you; it's the anomalies. But we focus on the regression line.
Yeah, it's the outliers, and I mean, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a whole book about this.
Yes,
topic, right? The outliers. If you go through the history of some of the most innovative things, be it in medicine like penicillin or other things, they were found randomly, right? Yes. And then, but it was about that curiosity of people looking at that, and I think in that case was Alexander Fleming, like looking at that. Oh, something happened to this Petri dish. Yeah. So let me explore what this is, right? This curiosity, right? And not saying, oh, I did a mistake here, just throw it away. But this curiosity, like looking at the outliers, going deep, trying to understand whether there is something there. And it's not always that there is something. There might be mistakes that we make. Yep. But this curiosity, I think, which also comes with scientific thinking, this is missing. So we step a ton of the essential steps and immediately go to the last step, which is the analysis piece and trying to prove everything based on data. And today, even large amounts of data. We'll talk about that in the second piece of this conversation when we talk about big data, right?
I'll just give you just an interesting story. So one of the world's foremost autism spectrum disorder researchers who may someday win the Nobel Prize for it. His work is Science, Nature articles like crazy. His name's Stephen Shearer, and I got to know him because I was on the board of the Hospital for Sick Children for 10 years, and he was one of the great scientists there. And he's really explicit about it. What he says is 100% of his Nature and Science articles come from looking at anomalies that other people ignored. He said that's his method. And he has a really interesting theory about it. He says nature is brutal, right? Nature pares away all the things that have no purpose, right? So we don't have tails anymore because they had no purpose, and nature got rid of our tails, right? And he said, if you find, because he's a geneticist, right? So if he said, if you find something that exists but doesn't fit, there's a reason, or nature would have gotten rid of that. And so I go and look at that. And he says something very interesting about the Human Genome Project. He said the Human Genome Project did not sequence the human gene, right? And I'm saying, but why did they call it the Human Genome Project? He said it sequenced a composite of hundreds of genomes that they made into a sort of an average genome, and got rid of all the outliers in it, right? And he said, all of my research comes from taking the things that they tossed out so they don't even look at, and asking, why is that there? And he's found most of the genetic backdrop to autism spectrum disorder on the basis of looking at things that other people completely ignored, as opposed to they had an explanation and his explanation is different. No, it's they had no chance to see it because it was gone by the time they got there. So I only highlight this by saying, right, if you're going to be a great strategist, and that's what I want people to be, you have to start not allowing your mind to be focused on the regression line, on the mean, on the median, on the mode. You can't ignore it, right, completely, but don't obsess about it, and ask the question, what's happening at the fringes? What's happening in the outliers, with the outliers, and what hypothesis could I create that would explain why that outlier exists, why nature, in some sense, if you use, like Stephen Shearer's thing is really good. Why did nature not crush that outlier so that I would have never even seen it?
Exactly.
There's some reason why it's there. Yeah.
Yeah. Gary Hamel brings this up several times as well. Like, innovation happens on the fringe, no matter where you look, like fashion, etc. It happens on the fringe. So you need to be open to actually see that. Now, before we go into this 7-step approach about how to come up with a great strategy, which is a lot about making choices, you recently, there was a video published with you by Harvard Business Review, and that's called "A Plan is Not a Strategy." And within less than 3 months, it got more than 1 million views. I think even you didn't expect that.
No.
Nor did the people at Harvard Business Review. Like a phenomenal success. And I've seen a lot of people raving about it on LinkedIn, etc. A lot of positive reviews. Now, you mentioned in that specifically, and we will connect it to this video so anybody can watch it. We don't have to share the whole message as part of this conversation. But he specifically emphasized on this topic that a plan, which is what a lot of organizations do, is not the same thing as having a strategy. And before getting into the strategy conversation itself, like how to get to it in 7 steps, in 1 or 2 sentences, what is a strategy? From Roger Martin.
Sure. A strategy is a set of choices that compels people you don't control, the customer, to take actions that you would like them to take. It's compelling to them, right? It's Steve Jobs saying, I'm not forcing you to buy this. Yeah, I have no control over you buying this or not. But you're going to be so compelled by the set of choices I've made as to what this looks like, what the features of it are, what the benefits of it are, that you're going to buy $180 billion worth of them a year. That's a strategy, right? A plan says, here's all the things that we have control over that we could do, and let's do those things because they're sensible things to do. Manufacturing thinks it would be good to build a new plant. Okay, we'd like our head of manufacturing. She's really good. We'll give her a new plant. The head of R&D says we want to work on this project. The head of sales and marketing says we want to do this new product. Planning is having a set of initiatives that are all sensible on their own, and that's but do not compel the people you don't control to do something. And that's why planning is incredibly popular and comforting. You plan because you can absolutely any reasonable plan can be put into effect, right? Because we can build the factory and we can launch this product and we can do this R&D project that comes up with a product, because none of that involves customers doing anything. Now, often the people at the end are sorely disappointed because their plan, nothing about their plan actually resulted in good things happening, and then they say, yes, well, those customers are very fickle, and we thought they were going to do this, but they didn't do that, or oh my God, this competitor did something that we didn't really forecast, and that it upset everything. So there's a million excuses where you can say, we did everything in our power. Look at the initiatives that we brought to the board. Look at the 12 initiatives. 1, we did that. 2, we did that. 3, we did that. 4, we did that. It's not our fault. It's chance, random events. Those are planners. And strategists are the ones that say, I have to make a set of choices under uncertainty and competition and constraints. And what's the best set of choices I can make that will cause the customers to do what we would like them to do. That's the big difference.
Yeah. That's the big difference. So thank you for that. Now, let's get into how we make those choices. And as part of your 7-step approach, the very first one is actually moving from issue to choice. Tell me a bit about that.
Well, as I've just described, the strategy is making an integrative set of choices. And what I've come to believe over time is that moving into that mindset from the very start is super important for strategy. Often the kind of strategies start with, what are the issues? Our customer base is aging. There is more Chinese competition. There are the channel is fragmenting because of digital, whatever issues, problems. And then somebody says, well, go study that. Go study channel fragmentation. Go study China. And what that tends to be is very diffuse because you haven't identified what choices do we face? And there's no time like the present to start thinking, gee, I need to make a choice. And how do I think about the need to make a choice? It's that if you ask the question, kind of what are the outcomes we're producing now? You can see what outputs are, whatever our profitability is this, or our share is that, or our share is going down, whatever. These are the outcomes now, right? And then you can ask, well, what do we wish those outcomes were? Right? That produces a gap, right, between what our outcomes are and what we wish they were. And if there's no gap, then don't do strategy. Just keep doing what you're doing. But the outcomes of today, right, are a result of cumulatively all the choices we've made up till today, right? Yeah. Every past choice accumulated together is the producer of the outcomes. So what I want people to focus on is what kind of choices do we need to contemplate making differently that would get us to step up from the outcomes we're achieving now to the aspirations that we have, and start the strategy process with that, the contemplation of choices.
Yeah. And you want people, as you mentioned, like from the start, get into the different mindset, right?
Yes.
And then the second step is obviously built on top of the first step. Otherwise, there wouldn't be the first step. Yes. Is about now generating strategic possibilities. Now, once they've moved away from thinking about issues, but thinking about choices, it's about, okay, so what kind of possibilities are out there? And as part of that second step, you have a set of things that you want people to look at, like desired outputs, like the people that you have. I think the rules are part of this. Walk us a bit through that second step, because that, from my reading and from my experience, this becomes very critical. I'm not going to say that any of these steps is more important than the other one, but I think in that second step, you really lay the foundation for coming up with a successful strategy at the end.
Yes. Well, the key thing that I would say about that step, like the one thing that's more important than anything else, is variety, right? Is because what strategy often does is focus quickly. If you do what I've said in the first step, wow, there's this gap. Well, how's about we do this? And then somebody says, okay, let's model that, and let's see how we can make whatever this is happen. And I say, no. Imagine multiple different possibilities. We could go left, we could go right, we could go up, we could go down. Very different possibilities, and in each case, they should be a description of, as I talked about in strategy, of where to play, how to win. We could play this way. We could expand, let's say, our customer base into new customers, right? Or we could narrow it, right? Or we could shift our emphasis, and how to win, and we would seek to do better than we're currently, because we're not winning as much as we need to win, by doing the following. So it's sort of a set of different possibilities of essentially where to play, how to win, and get a variety. Right, and at this point, I say in the process, I will not countenance anybody saying, I think that's a dumb idea. In fact, I'm pretty brutal on that. I'm not interested in any opinion at this point on whether it's a good idea. I just want a bunch of ideas at this point, but they have to be tied to that gap, right? You need to tell me a theory of how that choice would fix the gap that we've just identified. If you can't do that, it's not a useful possibility, right? I don't want to hear that would be undoable, right? Because we're going to worry about that later. What I want to know is that you have a theory that says, if we made that choice, we could make that gap go away.
We could make that gap go away. Now, you also emphasize on that you are very strong on the fact that you don't want a team, a group of people, just come up with one thing.
Right.
You want them to definitely have more than one, because if they only come with one thing, they haven't actually explored possibilities in plural, right? They probably have already, based on their past mindset, neglected a ton of ideas, thinking about feasibility and all of that. But you don't want that to happen. You just want the connection between the gap and then the theories that they come up with. As long as that's there, having multiple possibilities is a great thing. Another thing that you emphasize.
Can I just say, Sohrab, I want to give due credit to the design movement, right? I got very influenced by the design movement. I got it was a wonderful opportunity. I got to know, and I worked very closely with David Kelly and Tim Brown and all the wonderful folks at IDEO and other design firms, Design Continuum and the like. And if you hang around with them long enough, you can just see that it is just completely ingrained in their minds that unless you have variety, unless you have volume, you're not doing your job, right? They would never, like a David Kelly or Tim Brown, if they came out of an initial meeting on kind of, a design strategy. Yeah, here's the one thing. They would say, well, I've totally set myself up for failure. Totally. And they would go back into that meeting and say, we're not ending this meeting until we have 7 or some big number. So I was not there to that extent until I really got ensconced in that world. And I think they're just right. It's human nature. It's like a lot of these things are related, Sohrab. Like it's back to the focus on the regression line, right? In some sense, coming out of the meeting and saying, this is our most likely probability for success. And let's really focus on that. That's like focusing on the regression line. Exactly. And you're never going to find the outlier that's going to make a huge difference to the prospects of the business. So absolutely, variety is key. And this is why having different kinds of people in the meeting is a good idea. I always liked the Angela Ahrens Bailey combination at Burberry when they turned around Burberry, where they involved young designers in fundamental design decisions that typically only the most senior designer in the whole company, like Christopher Bailey, it would be all his decision. They reached down to the very youngest because they wanted a greater variety of interesting ideas that they would not come out of their own brains, right? They would come out of the brains of young folks, people from their Asian business, which was growing at the time. So set yourself up for the possibility of variety with a variety of people would be my advice.
Absolutely. And it's not only about like the people's age, right? Because that might come across as like, oh, you just need to get young. It's about more having people that are not tied too much to the status quo.
Yes.
Right? Because if you're tied to the status quo, it's difficult to let that go. It's, again, very human to protect whatever you have done in the past, and anything new that comes around is probably not as good because otherwise you would have thought about that in the past as well. Now, another point that you mentioned as part of this people section, and I'm going to read this out. If you show me a company where the planners are different from the doers, I will show you a company where what gets done is different from what was planned. But I do see this happen a ton of times, especially when you think about organizations bringing in even external people like consultants, the McKinseys, BCGs, Bains of the world, and they create the strategy, and then someone else has to execute it. So there is a reason you put this so specifically in there, because you've probably seen this happen a ton.
I have, and you've described it well. And I think this is one of the things that, kind of makes me unhappy about the world of strategy, right? That strategy is for these sort of people who got straight A's and 780 GMAT and went to a top 10 business school, and they're so smart that they can do strategy, whereas those kind of mediocre operating people, well, they don't have these gigantic brains that are necessary. Like I just like reject that notion 100%. I always want to know what the operators think, and often in strategy they are not like consulted, and it's a tragedy because, and I also like. This is a lesson that because I was a long time consultant before I became a dean, and what I had to learn is, like, I would think, just think about it. I would think sort of arrogantly, we've gone out as the consulting company, this super smart consulting company, and we've done 100 customer interviews, and now we know what customers want, right? And we know that because it was a statistically significant sample, randomly kind of selected, and whatever, it was all scientific. But then if you ask the sales force,
I was just going to go there.
How many customer interactions have you had in the 3 months it took us to do this research? And the answer for some companies would be, oh, that would be about 20,000. Yeah, about 20,000. And so, like, because we're so smart and we're scientific, our 100 counts more than your 20,000, right? And of course, some of the 20,000 is problematic. You know, there's bias in it, blah, 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 blah. But you can't ignore the 20,000 because you've done this precious 100. So I've gone completely in the opposite direction, which is I don't do a hell of a lot of independent customer work, which is what I used to do in my days as a strategy consultant way back when at Monitor Company. What I do is mine the minds of the sales folks as much as I can, and involve them in any kind of design of customer work, right? So you go and talk to all the sales folks and say, listen, here's what I hear you saying. Do you think we could explore this thing that you're saying that customers keep sort of harping about, but nobody's really delivering on it? How, like, what would be legitimate for you to explore that more? So just, if you want to be a great strategist, kind of hang around with the real operating people. It's like Charles de Gaulle, always be in with the outs, right? Even if they're not the mainstream strategy people, that's who you should hang out with. Hanging out with mainstream strategy people will just convince you, that you're all brilliant, which doesn't matter.
Now, you mentioned like the 20,000 that the salespeople talk to, and that's just the 3 months. If you look at the salespeople, how many interactions they had over a year, it's probably like 4 times that.
Yep.
And if you extend it, not only sales, but also customer support,
yes,
you again get different perspectives. There's a wonderful story that Colin Breyer and Bill Carr cover in their book on working backwards, both of them Amazon executives. Right? And Jeff Bezos goes to customer support and he sees one person in customer support, like getting an email from a customer who's just recently bought a table. And that customer support person, without reading the email, he can already predict what the issue is going to be, because it's not the first kind of an email he gets with regards to that table. And then he starts speaking to Jeff and says, you know what? We should actually have like this table packaged in a different way, and it should be displayed in the website in a different manner, because then we would get less customers asking about it and asking us to take it back. And then Jeff Bezos, he had just previous to that read about Toyota and the Andon card. He's like, oh, we need this in customer support, because they realize where the real issues are. And that's where like this customer obsession also gets extended to customer support and the interaction with like across different teams. And I think this is so important, that those 100 customer interactions that a consultant has are not going to equal anything close to what customer support, sales, marketing, etc. do. Now,
they're a rounding error. And again, it's the arrogance of science. It's a rounding error, but it's scientifically done. Randomized sample, analyzed properly, 2 standard deviations from the mean, all that. It's the arrogance of science that overwhelms the practicality of the people in customer service. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we've come up with possibilities, possibilities in plural, so more than one.
Yep.
And the interesting piece starts for me specifically here. So you can, like, everything we've done so far is very similar to design thinking. and maybe this piece as well, but you say you have to specify the conditions for success. And this is the piece where you don't ask about like, what kind of data do we have to support any of these possibilities? It's more about thinking, what would have to be true in order to say, hey, this is a great choice if we actually select this to be a piece of our strategy or the strategy. And you tie that with identifying the barriers to that choice. So this is step 3 and step 4. Walk me quickly through this, maybe with an example that you have at hand. I'm sure you have a ton as there are in this book, but like, what are some of the questions to ask? What is the approach to take? Who are the people to involve? How do we run this conversation? All of these elements.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the question is, what would have to be true at this point? It's reverse engineering, essentially. From an engineer's perspective, it would be reverse engineering. It would be to say, okay, if we were going to do this possibility, kind of what would have to be true for that to work, right? Yeah. It would be like, I don't know, Steve Jobs saying, well, I want to sell this little white wheelie thing that's really another MP3 player for 3 times what current MP3 players sell for. That's the possibility. Well, what would have to be true for that to be a good idea? What would have to be true about customers? They'd find it so incredibly valuable that they'll pay 3x for it. Kind of what would have to be true about competitors? Competitors couldn't replicate immediately kind of what we're doing. It's those kind of things that you'd have to specify about the possibility for it to be a good idea, right? Because what you can then do is say, well, 3x is a lot, and it's a new entrant, and I know it's white and it's got a wheel on it, but I mean, I don't think that's going to do it. But if we could make it really easy for the customer to download music on it, and in this user-friendly way, one song at a time, not an album at a time when they only want to actually listen to 1 or 2 songs on the album, right? That might do it, right? So you ask what would have to be true so that you can figure out what are the barriers. The barriers, that's an insane price. Then you can ask the question, how could we come up with a way around that barrier? And that's what Steve Jobs spent his career doing. He didn't formally use this process, but that was his thinking. He imagined possibilities, I think asked what would have to be true, right? And then figured out what of the things that aren't true now we can make true, and how do we make that true, right?
Part of 3x the price. Part of 3x the price would also be it could hold like 3 or 4 or 5x the number of songs, right? Yep. Which is then later their ultimate slogan, 1,000 songs in your pocket. But it starts with that question, right? What would have to be true in terms of desirability, in terms of feasibility, in terms of viability for the business, then thinking about the business model. So a lot of those questions, and you have a list of things to basically check, right? With regards to these conditions.
Yes.
Now, once you identify them,
if I can just say, what I tend to find is there are going to be what would have to be true questions about the industry, what would have to be true questions about the customer, what would have to be true questions about our capabilities relative to competitors, what would have to be true about our costs, and what would have to be true about competition for this to work. So there in the book, there's this little format that says, here's kind of a checklist. Ask what would have to be true in these categories, and you'll generally be able to get to fairly reasonable answers. And then you have a picture of the things that, if they were true, would make possibility A a great idea versus possibility B versus C versus D. And I hope I keep being a fruitful thinker, Sohrab. But if I ask the question in the first 41 years of my career, what's the single thing I think is most helpful and important, is that question, actually. I think it's the most important thing I've come up with, which is ask what would have to be true, not what is true, for what it's worth. Now I got to come up with another
when I was reading this, when I was reading this, I was thinking about a consulting project. Actually, my last consulting project is at Bain. Yes. It was a Korean company that wanted to, they were producing like all sorts of plastics, like polyethylene, polypropylene, etc. And they were thinking about expanding to the European market, mainly Germany. And so they hired the Korean team at Bain, and that team also reached out to Bain Germany. They wanted someone on the ground to do some analysis. Now, we basically went through what you are outlining here. But back then, I didn't have this framework, right? So we came up with possibilities, like what would be good, and what would have to be true. And what would have to be true after speaking to several potential customers was all about price. Because in this market, the quality of the product, right, it was like basically out of gas or oil, was almost more or less the same for everyone. It didn't matter whether it came from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or South Korea. Yeah. So it was all about price. Now, when you look at this, you realize, okay, South Korea is a bit further east than the other two countries. So they have a longer road. Now, they would have to figure out a way to have the same cost structure. Otherwise, they would be at a disadvantage. It was very clear that what would have to be true is looking at the shipping costs. And for us back then, that was the first test that we ran. And for you, like step 5 and 6 are identifying tests and conducting tests. We ran those tests, and the answer was like brutally honest and very clear. It makes no sense to bring these products to the German market, because you won't have, and not only you won't have a competitive advantage, you will have huge competitive disadvantages. Yeah. And you also outline in this book, so figure out like what is the order of the test that you want to run, and start with the one that is like where you are the most skeptical, because if that one's not true, you can already cut the possibility. You don't even have to look at the other questions, which makes it way more efficient. And it doesn't become as time consuming as the 7-step approach initially might look like.
Yes,
right?
I agree. And can I link this back to something we talked about earlier? So you were essentially taking the mindset of a strategist, not a planner, Sohrab, right? So what you came to the conclusion of is that all the things we could do that were in the South Korean company's control, you could do all those things and do them really well, would not compel customers to do what you want them to do, right? And so you were so a planner would say, now let's just try this, right? Let's make the best product we can. Let's ship it in. Let's build capacity. Let's do all those things, right? Because it's we can do all those things. But meanwhile, Sohrab sitting there saying, yeah, but if you do all those things, you ain't going to compel any customer to take action. So I just want to go back to that to highlight that is the mindset of the strategist. Is this compelling to the customers? It may be hard work, it may be investment, it may be you doing it all as well as you possibly can. That and $4.99 will buy you a decaf latte. It just doesn't matter if it will not compel the customer.
To the customer, the person you cannot control. That's I think an important addition that you always do. So this time I did. Absolutely. Now, you close that chapter with the 7th step, which is making choices. Mm-hmm. And what you write is, with the possibilities-based approach, which is what we just discussed, the choice-making step becomes simple, even anticlimatic. The group needs only to review the analytical test results and choose the possibility that faces the fewest serious barriers. And I've seen this happen in product development as well. When I run my product management, product owner courses, people come in and on day 1, they bring up a ton of questions like, okay, my biggest challenge is how to prioritize. I'm like, okay, I get that, but we need to go through a few things first. And when I walk them through these things, right, we start with a customer analysis, right, empathy mapping, whatever. We go into creating a product vision, creating a business model, creating all of it, and then developing a list of requirements, which is the product backlog. And only then we go into the prioritization. Suddenly I asked them, like, no, how did prioritization feel? Like, oh, that was super easy. I'm like, why? They're like, because we did all of these steps before. So when I was going through that book, I was like, yeah, that's exactly the same thing. If you do those things, right, you start with your issue, not the issue, but the choice. Yeah. Then you create the different possibilities, right? You try to have many of them. Then you come up with creation, like barriers of satisfaction, etc., right? What needs to be true, not what is true. Then you run your tests based on the things that you're most skeptical about. Then the choice in the end becomes more or less obvious. Yes. Is that the case? Did I interpret it correctly?
You are absolutely right. And to contrast, if instead you start as most strategy processes do, if you just looked at strategy processes overall, they start with a SWOT. They start with some issues. Got some issues. Let's do a SWOT. You get to the end, right? And people are saying, well, you're kind of like, what should we do? Because it hasn't driven you toward choice. It's driven you towards collection of mounds and mounds of information. And that's the sad thing. And that's because, again, there isn't this laser-like focus on a set of choices that compels somebody you do not control, right? That is absolutely the case. And you know, this is sort of recursive in many respects. That's employees too. Like, you know, last time I checked, we kind of outlawed slave labor a while back. And so employees are not your slave. You do not control them. You have to have a strategy for compelling them to want to spend a chunk of their life with you, right? And if you don't have a strategy for that, you know, you're going to get in trouble. And, you know, the world now is noticing that with, you know, massive disengagement, the Great Resignation, quiet quitting, all of those things together, right, are those people who you don't control, employees, saying, you're not compelling. The choices you've made about your relationship with me as an employee aren't compelling, and so I'm going to go do something else. So you have to have that mindset. That mindset kind of everywhere. You can have a plan for how many employees you're going to get. You have a plan for how much you're going to pay them. A plan for your benefit packages, but you know, that may not be compelling at all to the people you need to power your organization.
No, absolutely. And I mean, your customers pay you with money, your employees pay you with their time.
Yeah.
So ultimately, they are doing something. Now, to close this chapter on strategy, and again, I mean, the conversation should not replace reading the book, but I want to just capture this. You end this section with 3 fundamental shifts in mindset. The first one is, instead of what should we do, what might we do? The second one is, instead of what do I believe, to what should I have to believe? And the third one is, what is the right answer to what are the right questions? And these questions you mention, you're saying genuine inquiry must lie at the heart of any process that aims to be scientific. So going back to how we started this conversation, you're not making the case that a scientific approach is necessarily completely wrong, but it's more about skipping a lot of these steps. We talked about like observation, inquiry, and all of that, and just jumping to the data analysis is not going to be successful for an organization. And by the way, it's also not scientific.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That is correct. And that, for what it's worth, that's the biggest beef scientists have with me. They don't like the degree to which I'm critical of it. And they'd say, no, Roger, a true scientist kind of would never do what you describe. And I say to them, most of them are scientists who aren't in business. It says, well, you just don't understand what goes on in the name of science in business, which is this whole skipping of those important steps that you mentioned, and going right to as long as we crunch a lot of data, we're being scientific. So I think the great scientists kind of know that. And I'll always remember, I had a wonderful, pleasant meeting with one of my economic heroes, because I was an economist as an undergrad, and George Stigler, the Nobel laureate from Chicago, was one, and I got the chance to meet him and go visit him in his apartment, and he said, "Roger, I could not get a tenure stream job, let alone become a tenured professor today in an economics department like University of Chicago or any leading university." And he says, "It's because I insist on being scientific, and they insist on being faux scientific." That's a pretty tough, and he was very wistful about it. Because that was his beloved profession and the like, but the direction it had gone was not, in his view, consistent with being a true scientist, for what it's worth.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent addition here. Now, this is also a great segue to, and you are right, it makes more sense to talk about strategy first and then about data.
Oh,
so I'm glad I asked that question and didn't just make the assumption that my interpretation is better. And the segue is the following. You start this section about data with quoting an Ernst & Young study, where they say big data can eliminate reliance on gut feel decision-making. And you continue that by highlighting how the MBA programs today have become more of something where they try to have this hard science data approach to things. And at the same time, you say then, or your basically observation is creating great choices. And we talked about how we get to great choices requires imagination more than data. So this is more or less the context. And then you start, and we've had this conversation the last time we spoke, I think, or in one of our previous conversations. You start with the history of science. You go all the way back to Aristotle, and you make an important distinction, because Aristotle back then said that science is for all of those things that are as they are, right? We cannot change them. Whereas if we think about strategy, this is not determined. We are making choices about what our strategy is. Apple could have made a choice to stay in the pure computer business. Instead, they made a choice to go into music players and then later phones and so on and so forth. So that was not inevitable. That was a choice they made. And Aristotle himself specifically says that for those things that can be different as they are, the scientific mindset or approach is not necessarily the right one. So I want to give you the time and stage to talk to us a bit about that before we continue the conversation, then go deeper into what data can support and where we should take a different approach than just looking at how we can crunch more and more data.
Sure. Yeah. So we all owe a great debt to Aristotle, because he was the first scientist, really. He was the world's first scientist. People think the scientific method was created by Newton, Bacon, Galileo, Descartes, depending what country you're from. But really they formalized the method that Aristotle created, which was to kind of observe, collect data in order to determine what he referred to as the cause of the given effect. And Analytica Posterior, his book about that, is the most foundational text in all of the history of science. Everything builds off of that. But what people just ignored is that he created this distinction and actually warned. He said this method, as you said, this method is for the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are, right? And there are parts of the world where that is true, right? You were born, Sohrab, and that means you're someday going to pass away, right? We can't change that. We can't change the fact that if I let go of this, it is going to fall, right? This pen in my hand is going to fall, right? Those are immutable laws of nature. And so what Aristotle said is, in that part of the world, use the scientific method. Now, if you want to be statistical about it, there's a good reason for it, right? Because what we know is if you want to make inferences to a universe from a sample, so a whole bunch of droppings of a pen, that's a sample. That's not all the pens that have ever dropped in the world. That sample has to be representative of the universe, right? And so if we combine that with the fact that all data is from the past, as of the time of analysis, every single piece of data that you could possibly analyze is from the past. Even if you've just run an experiment quite recently, it's still in the past. Well, what would make that representative of the universe that you are trying to understand? It would only be representative if the future is identical to the past, right? And so for some things, we're pretty confident. I think next week, when I let go of this pen, it's going to drop. And it's going to drop in Florida. It's going to drop in Germany. It's going to drop in Antarctica. It's going to drop everywhere on the surface of our planet. And so statistically speaking, right, now that we have all that kind of knowledge of statistics, we are drawing a representative sample by looking at the past, right? Then Aristotle created this distinction. He said, well, there's another part of the world where things can be other than they are. And again, if you use this iPhone, right, how many smartphones were there in 1999? Answer's 0, right? The first one came out, the BlackBerry, in 2000. How many are there now? Last number I saw was 4.4 billion. 4.4 billion of them. Well, that's a future, right, that is decidedly different from the past. And what Aristotle said is statistically pretty simple. He said basically that if you draw a sample from the past to try and understand the universe, right, it's an unrepresentative sample, because if you did that sample in the future, it would be different. If we sampled in 1999, hey, we'd come up with the conclusion that, well, smartphone demand, I don't know, who knows, it's pretty low. It's probably not going to be pretty high. If you did that in 2022, you'd say, well, smartphone's the most important product on the planet, and there's more of them on the planet than anything other than people. Well, that's because those are two different samples. So what he said, though, that is hard for the modern business person to get through their heads is not, you have to modify how you use the scientific method or whatever. He said, don't, right? Literally, the father of science said, in that area, do not use it. And what he said instead is, you must imagine possibilities and choose the one for which the most compelling argument can be made. And the business world has ignored the father of science completely and utterly, and uses science for both parts of the world. And for me, again, as a business school dean, or ex-business school dean, thankfully, it's amazing to me that virtually every MBA program these days has a first year's required stats course. And in that stats course, the statistics professor will dutifully explain about representative samples and how you can make sure your sample is representative, and you should never, ever, ever make an inference to a universe of a sample that's stratified or biased or whatever. Don't go there. Then they walk across to the next classroom and go into finance or marketing or strategy, and they are literally told to make decisions scientifically by doing samples and then making a decision on the basis of that. Right? The conflict between those things is so extreme. It's amazing. You are told in one class, it is a horrible, grievous error to extrapolate to a universe from an unrepresentative sample. And then you're immediately told you must extrapolate from an unrepresentative sample or you're not being rigorous. It's a scary thing.
It's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult to digest. So based on that, you go into the following point, and you already touched about it a bit, saying executives or people, whoever wants to make choices, actually, right? It doesn't have to be the people at the top. Everyone in the organization is affected by this, both at work, but also at life, to distinguish between the things that can be changed, right? And the ones that cannot.
Yes.
And then focus mainly on the things that can be changed. But even within the things that cannot be changed, and you give the example of a bottle company that within the laws of physics still figured out to change the process because they imagined how things could be different. Right. Still first principle thinking, like the laws of physics in place, all of that. But still that can and cannot thinking help them come up with a different approach. And based on those things that can be changed, you then make the case, and you just mentioned this as well, that other than having data, you need to construct a persuasive narrative. And the interesting thing is that the father of like coming up with a persuasive narrative is the same person as the father of science, being Aristotle. Yeah. Now, walk us through this, not necessarily what the narrative can be, but you can also capture that. But the importance of coming up with the narrative, how to have it, then how that narrative results in conversations. And ultimately, the bigger topic today is making choices. Help us make better choices with and without data.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is the thing that, again, people, everybody who's ever studied the history of science has read Analytical Posteriori, Aristotle's book on science. And like almost no one in the world, I bet the number of people in the world who've read Rhetoric, his book on how you make decisions in groups in the part of the world where things can be other than they are. I bet there aren't 10,000 people in the world living today who've read Rhetoric, because it's not taught anywhere, whatever. But it's this book that essentially talks about how you have to make decisions and the skills and capabilities you need to make them in this part of the world where you're trying to invent a future that doesn't exist. I mean, and he was quite lyrical about what he said. He said in the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are, right? Essentially, the job of human beings is to understand the causes of the effects we see, and then essentially to optimize to those, right? So if we see tens of thousands of people dying from cancer for smoking, we can then try and optimize and try and discourage people from smoking, because lungs and nicotine aren't going to change, and that's always going to happen. But he said, in the part of the world where things can be other than they are, the job of human beings is to be the cause of the effect they want to see. Which, and I don't know if Mahatma Gandhi was a student of Aristotle or not. I don't know. He was classically trained and brilliant, obviously, but in some sense, be the cause you want to see in the world is so Aristotelian. If he were alive today, I would love to know that came. But that is your job in some sense. What he assigned you, your job is to be the cause of the effect you want to see, and the method for doing that is to imagine the possibility that you would like to see, and then figure out how you can engage in dialogue, kind of argumentation with the people necessary to build the consensus around the pursuit of that possibility. right? And so, and his book's called Rhetoric, which later became kind of a term for empty argumentation, right? For Aristotle, it was sort of the fundamental kind of thinking approach. And for me, my interpretation of it is what Aristotle said is, if you have to strip out the data because you have no data about the future, then you either win or lose on the basis of the strength of the logic, right? Is the logic compelling enough in the absence of having data now to be able to invest behind the logic, right? And again, to use Steve Jobs, because he's such a good example, is like, until this came along, right, people did not type on glass. Right?
Oh, they didn't.
They typed on little QWERTY keyboards. The dominant player in the 100% market share was of people typing on that, right? And somehow Steve Jobs made the argument, nope, glass. They're going to be typing on glass. And for the most part, these things were closed. They came installed with the various software tools you'd want. And he said, no, we're going to give you, we're going to make these little things, and you can pick whatever ones you want of your own, right? What the hell was he talking about? There's no data to support any of that, right? Yeah. But he made enough of an argument, right, that said, here's why I think people will get used to typing on glass. They'll love being able to customize their phone. Brilliant strategy when you think about it. One piece of hardware, a bajillion customized solutions. And not only that, you are in control of the customization entirely. So he made an argument that said this could be a different way of doing this, and he was the cause of a new effect, of an absolute explosion in the use of this, an explosion of an ecosystem of hundreds of thousands of developers who are just developing to get a tile on that screen, zero of which Steve Jobs pays for, right? It's like perfect.
They even make money on it.
Yeah. And they take 30%, and that's now a $70 billion business. $70 billion. And what's the gross margin on that business, do you think? 95%?
It's good.
Something like that. How many $70 billion, 95% gross margin businesses do you know out there? So the real skill that is not, I think, developed in the business world is this skill in argumentation where you don't have data. Now, the question is, again, do you have no data at all? Did Steve Jobs have no data at all? No, it just wasn't systematic scientific data, right? His approach to what you see is what you get came out of calligraphy, right? His love for calligraphy, which he studied in college, or at least had courses in college. So here's back to get away from the regression line and look and say, well, there was this thing over here and this thing over here. It's like Johnny Ive, the colors of the iMac were borrowed from 20 years ago, 20 years previously, a line of cameras called the Savoy cameras. Same Pantones, exactly. So it's not as though there's an absence of data entirely. The question is it scientific data? And the answer is no, it is not. And so it's not claimed as that. Johnny Ive didn't say, I'm positive that customers will love these tangerine and grape and peach colored computers. But he said, there's a reason to be confident of it, and we'll have to convince them. We'll have to convince them it's a good idea, and be the cause of the effect that we want to see. So that's...
Now, this part, Roger, we have to convince them, because Steve Jobs was brilliant at presenting this stuff then whenever he got on stage.
Yes.
And while you were talking on the about the iPhone, I remember in 2007, I saw that presentation, and he takes you through the reasons why you would want to type on glass.
Yes.
And he doesn't say that typing on glass is a better feeling than typing on the BlackBerry.
Yes.
But he takes you through the reason why it is necessary to remove that keyboard, that hardware keyboard, because you then get these bazillion, as you mentioned, configurations based on whatever app you need. Is it the camera? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it, I don't know, something to draw? I mean, the iPhone still, I mean, you can draw with your finger, but that's the thing. So is that for you also some kind of litmus test to be able to then sell this story, right, this rhetoric to your customers, and not only internally?
Absolutely. I think it's to your customers, it's to your shareholders, right? The people who are giving you the money to do it. It's to the distribution channel, right? He was able to go to AT&T and get the most lopsided distribution deal I've ever heard of in my life for in exchange for exclusivity. So it's being able to make those arguments, and this is where again there is an intersection with the world of design, right? I mean, design is just this interesting world that is kind of atheoretical to a great extent, but intuitively has got so many things right. In the world of design, right, storytelling is huge. Why? Well, it's because designers are consistently asked to create something that does not now exist, right? They're not brought in
by default.
Bain and Company is brought in to get 10% out of our cost structure, right? You don't bring in IDEO for that. So they're brought in to create something that does not now exist, which means they have to be good at something other than crunching data. What do they have to be good at? Storytelling, right? And so because of the world that the designers occupy, they've come up with almost intuitively things that they have to be good at, and that's one of them. Strategy consultants, unfortunately, come from for in the main this scientific, and dare I say faux scientific kind of word, which is that the analysis will tell you the answer. And if you don't believe the answer, it's because you're unscientific or a moron, right? That unfortunately, that's often and often I would get into fights with my own case teams when they'd come back and say, "Well, the client didn't believe this." It's because you did 100 interviews and they have 20,000 that say something else, but you just dismiss them as not being scientific. The designers can't do that, because they don't have data to prove their nifty idea will work. So they have to craft and tell a story. And I think that's why, interesting enough, like they're being hired by the tech firms, designers, like crazy now. And I think it's because the tech firms have figured out that they know something. They have a skill set that the tech firms don't have inside and are trying to integrate it in. So I think they're being very smart. Google is hiring just unlimited numbers of folks from the major design firms.
Yeah, no, it makes absolutely sense. So closing this conversation on making choices, we talked about strategy, we talked about data, we identified, or you basically outlined, it's not my accomplishment, it's yours. I just went into this conversation with you, like highlighting the areas. And for me, this is maybe the most important piece, where things can be different as they are and where things cannot, right? And really focusing on that. And within those areas where things can be different, think of ourselves as the cause that results in an effect.
Yes.
Instead of looking for a cause and effect relationship. And once you take that perspective, you also realize how much power you have what you can actually do. And this brings me back to one of the interviews with Steve Jobs that I saw. You mentioned him several times. So where he says at some point he realized that everything built around him has been built by human beings, which means that he, if he wanted to, could build a ton of things that would be around other people. And I mean, by God, did he succeed, right? Yeah. With his company, obviously, with the people working with him. And I think having that agency, being aware of the power that we have, either being products that we build, strategies that we create, organizations that we build, like voluntary work that we do, that is truly inspiring for me, because that brings me with a completely different also sense of urgency, but even like excitement to work, because I realize it's not about just doing everything that I've been doing so far. And my life is not determined to be something. I'm not destined in a certain direction. I can take agency. I have the power to do this, but I have to focus on the things that can be as different as they are, and let's focus on those things that cannot be, take them as a given, try to improve around them. Yep. And based on that, then succeed with whatever I want to succeed in my life. So, Roger, as usual, I learned so much.
No, and your summary is really, I think, quite profound, Sohrab. So, I mean, I think it is an agency, personal agency story. And I think it's a great job. Like the job you described, spending your life being the cause of the effects that you want to see. Hey, what's not to like about that job, right? And I think it's an exciting, and it's an exciting job, and we should all sort of revel in our human capacity for doing that. We have imagination. We can take little snippets of data, right? Ideas, put them together to create something that hopefully will make the world a better place. So I like your summary.
Yeah. What better words to end this with as what you just said, Roger. Thank you so much. As usual, we're going to have another conversation around this book here. A new way to think. This was our second conversation of, we don't know how many, but I think we'll still be going on that. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye. Till next time.
All righty. Take care.